Hello, welcome to the W3C OpenActive Technical Working Group call for Thursday, 25th of November. The topic for this call is going to be a little bit of a mishmash, actually. We're going to be looking at some issues that arose with regard to dependent accounts from the W3C call yesterday, and then we'll move on through the membership proposal document as per usual. But before we start in on that, if I can just go around and ask people to introduce themselves for the sake of the recording. And just calling on people in the order in which they appear on my own screen. Nathan, can you start, please?
Hi, I'm Nathan. I'm the lead developer at Playfinder and BookTech.
Thank you, Nathan. Matt.
Matthew Davies from sports.com.
Thank you, Matthew. Debbie.
Debbie Giordano from Everyone Active.
Thank you, Debbie. Andy Gordon.
Andy Gordon from Gladstone, senior product owner.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And finally, Nick.
Hello, Nick from Lyman.
Okay, fantastic. So I will share my screen here. Is everybody looking at the presentation now? Okay, great. I'll just review where we got to in the last call, and then I will take us to where we got to on the last W3C call, the more high-level conversation that happens on Wednesdays. And then we can unpick some of the details that are some of the problems that arose in the course of that call yesterday. So we'll be looking at the membership proposal as per usual. In the previous call, we moved through Appendix B, which is the wireframes for the registration flow, and just clarified a few points there. We started looking at how we model customer accounts and customers. That's Appendix C1 and C2. And we made good headway through sections 3 and 4, authenticating an existing customer account and viewing and updating customer account details from the broker. One of the issues that arose in the course of that call, though, was how to deal with minors, essentially, how to deal with children who are booking on and who might not have their own individual account. So that led to an agenda for the higher level W3C call, the Wednesday call, taking a look at what the requirements are for minors in the booking spec. And I think that got clarified fairly readily, actually. The differences between how minors are treated and how adults are treated are not huge. So we unpicked where those differences lay. However, we did come up to some specific points of detail that I hope we can resolve on this call about flow and questions about handling payment and whether they were in scope for discussion within the proposal itself. So I'll flip over to this graphic, which Nick helpfully prepared. The issue, to summarize, is that it's possible in MCR Active and presumably also in Active Westminster and more broadly, that people under the age of 18 will be able to have an MCR Active broker-based account. In fact, in MCR Active, children as young as 8 can do this. And certainly use cases above the age of 13 are very common. So it could well be the case that somebody's got an MCR Active account who doesn't necessarily have their own account under their own name on the booking system side. However, they might be present in the system as a dependent. And there were a couple of models for how you went about this, but the basic idea seemed to be that you'd have account holders conceived of in a couple of different ways who were able to associate other people with the account. So in the case of the primary dependence circle here, you've got a notion that there's one person who's the account holder who essentially pays the bills, whose credit card is the one that the direct debits are taken from, and so on. And then they can associate other people with their account. In the group situation, it's much the same, although you might have different payment arrangements there. But again, there's this notion of people being associated with the account who are not the bill payer on the account. and who are affiliated with it in a sort of subsidiary relationship. So the question that this raised for me was actually, what is the flow here? So say the 13-year-old, 14-year-old logs into a broker account, that broker authenticates to a booking system on which the child is associated as a dependent or as a member of a group, rather than having their own account under their own name. What happens then? And I suppose this is a question that I'm going to be throwing open to people who are closely associated with systems on the call, because it wasn't clear to me what the expected behavior was going to be.
Sorry, is this the question of if the parent logs in, what do they see, or if the child logs in?
Well, I think it's probably both, but I assume in the case of the parent, it's kind of unproblematic, in that, they're the primary account holder or they're the bill payer. They've got their own account. They log in on the broker under their own account. Everything proceeds more or less as normal. And if they have the ability to make a booking for their child in the booking system, they can do that.
So
Just
my
going back
understanding
to the point
yeah, go on. No, sorry, go
that
on,
you
Debbie,
said,
please.
that the child didn't have their own account, that the children do have their own account. From a Gladstone perspective, each individual has their own account, and each individual can, in our world, can log in, regardless of who they are or their age, as long as there's an email address and a password associated to that account. The accounts are created from an age of 0. There's not an 8-year-old limit or anything like that from a database perspective in our world. So you would still be validating whether that account exists or not already.
Right. Okay. What happens with payment in that case?
Well, the child can still make bookings. You're assuming that it's not the child logged in at home, but you're assuming if they've got email address and password associated to that account, it can be logged in as that person, and that person is therefore making the bookings and making payments for that person. As it stands, the Gladstone software suite as a whole doesn't allow primary members to book for others. It's coming, it's like on the verge of being there, but it doesn't exist at the moment.
Okay.
My suggestion, Debbie, would be from a Gladstone perspective, if we talk about the standards in terms of the new features rather than the old ones, because by the time we actually come around to do this, I imagine that we'll be in the new world.
Okay, but so the new world would still require each individual to have an account. That won't change.
And I think on yesterday's call, it was mentioned that there might be a 8-year-old limit. Are we saying, and I guess Andy was on both calls, so is that just to triple check? Are we saying that there isn't actually a restriction on age then for the child account? In fact, there's no 8 years or whatever. It's just any age you can create an account.
Any age you can create an account. If you were using our own join online system, then we have forced it to say that if you try and sign up an under 16-year-old, you have to create an adult record as well, and then the two get associated. And that should be the process within the centres as well when they're adding them to MRM, but MRM hasn't got its own rules to tell you that.
No, it's more to do with the pushing through the marketing preferences and that sort of thing as well. We've got a default of 13, under 13s you don't market to. But I mean, again, that can be altered as necessary.
I mean, our default is 16. We don't market to anybody under 16. So even if the record is created, it's got an email account, we wouldn't deliver anything to that individual.
So I guess conceptually then, it's more of a concept of linked accounts than an account that's got sort of additional people it's several customer accounts that are linked to each other, not a single customer account that's got multiple customers associated with it, I guess is the distinction.
They're all individual records.
They're all
Yeah.
individual records.
All individual linked to a primary account for association only.
Okay.
So that's maybe the keywords there for association only. So the only primary account isn't special other than being the association. Is that right? Right. So if the primary account leaves the group, does the group disband?
You would need to allocate a new primary in that particular instance.
Got it. Fine. So it's completely.
But there's no way for an individual to remove themselves from that group.
Yeah.
It's
And
not
that's all
something that you
administered
can go
internally.
online and do.
In the new world, or as planned at all.
Existing now, but I wouldn't expect us to want to introduce that, because then you could have children disassociating themselves from their parents, and that's not a place I would want to go.
Right. And what about the additions of new accounts? I presume would be in there, so you could add a child as a dependent.
When you're talking about new world, are you talking about the ideal world, or what's been introduced with Gladstone for Book for Others?
I think Nick's talking about the association piece at the moment, and I just want to be clear. When we say the new world, Nick, are we talking about what we're looking to aim to roll out at Manchester or Westminster right now, or are we going to a second phase?
Oh, second phase.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know if that's Book for Others or past that point, because if we design these standards for where we want to get to, and then make sure that they also meet our interim needs, so there may be a smaller version of them that works for whatever we need for the next 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. If we start with the whole idea, you know what I mean, then reduce it rather than the other way around. We
need to be clear, Nick. When is even the initial proposal going to be fixed in concrete with regards to what we're aiming to achieve? Because at the moment, sorry, apologies if I'm here to be controversial, the standards are changing, and we were supposed to deliver this however long ago.
My understanding is that dependent accounts is phase 2 from an implementation.
Yeah, I'm talking generally though, Nick. There seems to be more things appearing in going through these discussions, and I don't think there's a clear distinction with regards to what's a phase 2 until now versus what's a phase 1.
So my understanding so my understanding was that the only thing that is phase 2, and it's in the document as out of scope, is dependent accounts. That's the only thing that of all the things we've talked about, and it's in the proposal at the top of the doc. It says in scope, out of scope, and in the requirements we spoke about before.
Yeah, that was only last week, though, wasn't it? That was actually found that actually this was something that was missing from the scope.
No, dependent accounts has always been on there. It's always been a thing to talk about. The new information last week that we discovered was that we realised that we hadn't thought about if a child logs in themselves, and I think it sounds like we've concluded that there's no real difference if the child logs in on versus a parent, except that we need an emergency contact to be provided. That was the new bit, I think.
The emergency contact as such would be the main person that's the primary.
Yes, sounds like that's what we're saying would be the case for Gladstone.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'm a little bit concerned about is how Anne-Marie pitched it yesterday. Is there'll be minimal details that will be passed for this emergency contact, or for the integration. There needs to be not necessarily minimum details being passed from MCR or Westminster, but there needs to be minimum details so that record can actually be created as well. So beyond beyond a name and beyond a phone number and email address.
Yes, that's a good separate concern. Definitely, we should talk about that. Yeah, absolutely. I just sorry, just a bit of a kind of overall point here. It's what you said, Andy, about us making sure we still get through the standard and don't get hung up on this kind of piece that's probably phase 2. I think we spoke about it yesterday because it was the requirements gathering call, but I know that these calls, at least I think we mentioned, I don't know if we said it, at some point we've said we were going to do entitlements at the end, dependent entitlements at the end of these calls, because we didn't want to get hung up on it until we concluded all the stuff for phase 1. So I know that might just be a good reminder for us to just remember that maybe we don't going to get too bogged down into this. It's good to clarify what we spoke about yesterday to make sure we've kind of squared off the 8+, age and things like that. But maybe we don't want to get into the weeds of this too much today, because as you say, we want to make sure we nail down the phase 1 stuff before we get caught up on the phase 2 stuff.
I think we need to be clear that it definitely is a phase 2, because the impression, I might be wrong, but the impression I got from Anne-Marie, the way it was sort of being pitched, was that it was sort of like it came across as sort of an expectation for the rollout.
For children to be able to book
the whole flow that that Anne-Marie went through, and I asked if she could provide some form of written account of the flow which she wanted. It didn't seem to get any response on that. I think that's what's missing, is that from an end user's perspective, from the broker's perspective, what's the level of expectation? She talked as if there were screens already there. May not well be, but there's a flow. It'd be nice to have that sort of detail.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue here is that, from my understanding, is Gladstone, Flow, and Legends are all in the middle of developing the feature for this dependent account stuff. So there isn't. So at the moment, it's difficult to nail down exactly what is going to get delivered, because no one's actually got the thing finished yet. Which is why.
How can we aim to deliver something if we don't even know what the specified requirement is?
So that's I think what we're talking about, being a phase 2 thing. Or maybe we're talking about different things. Sorry.
Yeah, so I've lost the plot a bit here. So yeah, I'd assumed that requirements were already kind of agreed, but hadn't really been elicited. And these requirements were to be delivered for MCR Active. What are the development timelines looking like for Gladstone on this?
On this piece,
it's not even been drawn up yet, Tim. So
No.
we don't know. We can't predict anything when we haven't got the detail to put something together to understand when it's going to work. The stuff that Gladstone are doing is book for others, and that's about booking for people that are already associated to your account. It's not about creating new accounts and linking them together, any of that. It's just booking for people that are already associated to your account.
Yep.
So that's not catering for any of this, and that doesn't mean that book for others is in the endpoints either. So this is an unknown.
Okay, sorry, I'm still struggling a bit. So
we don't have any idea about the implementation detail that will sit behind this spec, because the systems themselves haven't finished their own implementations yet. But what this is talking about is the higher level. What the it sounds like what we've established is what the standards should ideally do, and we've got a thing about the primary and secondary people, and we've understood that. But in terms of getting into what Gladstone can and can't deliver against this, we're not going to know that yet, because that hasn't been done. Same with Flow, same with Legend. So I guess, and then my point about phase 2 is we probably can't go much further in the technical weeds of this subject until those systems have moved forward, because it's completely hypothetical otherwise. And so probably best for us to kind of park this issue and continue through the main document, and talk about phase 1 things.
And the expectation from an MCR's perspective, based on what Andy sent me off the back of the call yesterday that I unfortunately missed, I think that needs a conversation just between ourselves and MCR, because those rules that they're specifying are different to our rules. And we need to be aligned on that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Those rules regarding the are we talking about dependent accounts or child accounts?
The age limits as one.
Oh yeah.
As one example, that's not what we do. So my expectation would be, if anybody tries to sign up on MCR that is under 16, a parent account has got to be created at the same time, and that means taking full details for that parent in the way that we would do, and that the two need to be associated as part of that member creation process. That's what I would expect, because that's what we do.
Sorry, yes, that is in phase one.
Yeah.
That is in phase one. That's not about, that's just about the child booking on their own account. That's not about the child booking on behalf, the parent booking on behalf of the child or anything like that, is it?
No, but you're talking about creating accounts here.
Yeah.
What's in phase one then?
So phase one is everything to do with one person logging in and booking. That's a parent or a child. The phase two thing we're talking about here is anything with these circles where there's one person in the group that can book on behalf of another person in the group. So that's phase two.
You're just talking about booking on behalf of. What about the member creation process where somebody is under a certain age?
That's phase one.
And how has that been? I have to admit I haven't seen it, so I don't know what the rules around it are about what is the member creation process if somebody is under a certain age.
So that's probably, and that's probably the thing to maybe move on to then, is that which is the question about what details are captured. Well, and maybe that's the left-hand part of this diagram actually, and it just happens to be there. The emergency contact for minors being captured. That was the conversation we had yesterday.
Well, that was one aspect of it, but there's also the fact is that not just emergency contact details, there's also whether you want the full details or what EA require as details.
So my memory of the conversation yesterday was that this was analogous to the possibility that required fields for member creation would be different on the broker side and the booking system side. And that earlier conversation about that possible mismatch had just been that all of that is sort of out of band, that there's a contractual understanding between the broker and the booking system that handles that. And that's something that the specification itself doesn't specify. There's no required fields from the point of view of the spec. Is this something that we can also just out of scope for the specification in terms of the rules around what parental details are required? Or is that really just a kind of other required field? Or is there something there that needs to be unpicked further?
I think there's a good question about the emergency contact as it's currently referenced in the spec itself. Only contains a name and phone number field, and I think MCR's intention was only to capture that detail for the child that registers with MCR and then wants to make bookings. So it sounds like if there's more data required for that for everyone active. Is it worth us having a separate conversation with, for example, MCR about this particularly, folks, and then we come back to this forum rather than doing it here? It was what Debbie was kind of proposing a minute ago.
Yeah, I think that's wise, because at the moment it sounds like that. Sorry, Debbie, but it sounds like there's a discussion that needs to take place between MCR and everyone active to iron out what the minimum requirements are for the integration.
I
don't
believe
disagree, but that conversation was only had yesterday, so
absolutely. I think it would be wise, because then it also, Debbie and David as such can then hear the same pitch there where Anne-Marie was coming across yesterday, and then work through setting the level of expectation as well, because I certainly got the impression that it was beyond the emergency contact details. I may just be the way I was reading it, but certainly Book for Others was in the forefront of their mind as well, or the ability to be able to do that. But I didn't get the impression that was a phase two from Anne-Marie's perspective.
Can we be really, really, really clear what is phase one and what is phase two? Is Book for Others is it just Book for Others that's phase two, but the creation and the association and booking as a child is all phase one?
It's association and Book for Others that's phase two. Everything else is phase one. The list you just said.
Sorry, where is this documented?
If you go into the proposal, at the top of the proposal as it stands, and at the very top there's a list of scope.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
And you can see points 1 to 8 and points 9 and 10. So you can see that, and I'm just paraphrasing there, Debbie, 9 and 10 you can see in front of you there. Sorry, have you scrolled slightly down, Tim? There you go. 9 and 10, it says adding and removing dependent accounts. That's association. And booking on behalf of dependent accounts, that's book for others.
Okay. But there's no reason why number 2, creating a customer account, would be restricted in any way around somebody's age. Is that what we're saying?
Exactly. So it needs to account for juniors, and that's exactly it.
And so at the minute, that agreement for part 2 is any account can be created regardless of the age, but there's no requirement, there's no current part of step 2 that says if that person is under age X, then we also need to create another account.
No, that's exactly right. That's the bit that's missing. It's currently an emergency contact with only name and phone number.
Okay.
And we're just going to raise some niggling terminology questions. Okay, so first of all, phase 1 and phase 2. So right now, actually, those phrases do not appear in this discussion of scope.
Sorry, they're Gladstone specific phases. That's
right.
Why.
Okay. Thank you. Now it all becomes a lot clearer. So the issue is that requirements for MCR active, in fact, seem to include these items that are declared out of scope.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And this is not on Gladstone's roadmap at all right now, but seems to be an assumption of MCR active. Okay. Right. Sorry. I'm now up.
Yeah. And to give you the full clarity, it is on very much on the GLL and flow roadmap. I know that Stephen talked about some of that, and so that's part of this. And I know that we also, in the requirements conversation, slightly to confuse things, this is very clearly scope and out of scope. This part of this document has been like this since August, maybe before that. This hasn't changed as this is written. But we had a conversation maybe in September or October where we talked about, in these calls, making sure that we covered both 9 and 10 as well as 1 through 8, so that we had a full view of everything in the standards conversation and can design appropriately rather than phasing the standards work. But obviously the implementation is phased because it depends on information that, it depends on features that haven't yet been built.
Just going back to what you just said there, Nick. So are we saying that Legend are at a point where, as part of the initial rollout for MCR active, it's going to include 9 and 10? What's going to happen is the full rollout is, this is definitely an MCR specific conversation. The full rollout, which will be with flow, does include 9 and 10, but Legend are not currently at a point where they include 9 and 10, which is why it's future. That's helpful. Just because you said that phase 1 and phase 2 was Gladstone specific, but I don't feel like it is Gladstone specific. I feel like when we discussed this with Westminster before on the call, we said, because this is constantly changing, we've got to draw a line under it at some point and said, this what is expected to be delivered is phase 1. And then what else, whatever comes after this point is a phase 2 delivery. And I don't feel like that's just a Gladstone thing. I feel like that's an overall standard thing. So yeah, I mean, the way that they're doing it in GLL and Flow, I believe, is they're doing 1 through 10 at once, but that might be, yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that they're waiting a bit longer to do the membership bit because they're going to do it quicker, but they're going to do it later, and they're going to wait till they do 9 and 10 in there as well. When I say later, I'm talking about sometime, I think April next year or March next year in terms of finished and delivered. So I know everyone's working at different timescales, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because everyone's got different team sizes and things like this. So it's not straightforward in terms of phasing, I don't think. Okay, so as a standard, in principle, the standard can proceed independent of implementations, or the initial drafting can be done independent of implementations, although implementation feedback will then inform future iterations of the docs. To what extent is it possible to proceed with discussion of 9 and 10, given
the uncertainties around timeline and implementation. Because I feel like in principle, as a standards exercise,
it's quite confusing.
Sorry, say again, Debbie?
But
Oh, she's gone.
Okay, sorry. Right.
I was going to suggest, although Debbie may come back and say the same thing, we probably want to ideally focus on 1 through 8 in terms of the technical stuff first, so that people who are waiting to implement have that clarity.
But we're extending 2 though, aren't we? For the emergency contacts.
Yes, I mean, emergency contact is included in 2 in this document, so it's just clarifying, I suppose, that 2 includes that, which maybe isn't obvious by this line.
Right, so it's...
Hi, Debbie, you back?
Yeah, sorry, I had a
Sorry,
connection issue.
we didn't hear what you said before you dropped, unfortunately. Are you still there?
Confusing. I'm finding it quite confusing as to what's expected to be delivered in a phase 1 or a phase 2, and who that phase 1 applies to, and who that phase 2 applies to, and what the expectation is from the customer. It's all very grey. We need something to work to, and for that to stop changing, so that we can actually deliver something.
So I think 1 through 8 hasn't changed. That's been the same. It's just obviously we didn't interpret 2 as including children before. That's clarity that's been added there. So that's the same. 9 and 10 also haven't changed, and they weren't previously being included in, I understand, in the kind of in the phase 1 scope of Gladstone. So I don't know if this has changed because this document's been the same, but we probably just need to be really clear that, as you say, I
think the document is grown with regards to the detail that's in there.
Yes, it has, yeah.
Because originally when we saw it, it was basically the top half of the document, and then all the appendices have been added. And I don't think we've actually revisited it as such. And that's why there's a sense that we're finding new things as we're going through this.
Yeah, so we're going, absolutely, as we're fleshing out the detail. And I imagine when it comes to implementation, we'll find further details that are missing. You know,
I think that's the challenge, Nick, is that we're finding details we're discussing, but in theory, this is what we're supposed to be delivering upon, but we're only finding things out now.
So I mean, I suppose there's a separate. If we're going through this together to understand it fully, and maybe this is a separate. This is probably a separate conversation about because I know there's a document, isn't there, from the Gladstone perspective that's going to include a bunch of stuff that is going to.
Well, that's more to do with the it incorporates this, but that's mainly around the booking area with regards to what's covered in the booking side of things and what you can do, and the interaction with the OpenActive booking API. This is separate.
So that doesn't include memberships.
Well, it will encompass it, but what we're saying is this is being fleshed out right now, and yet we're being asked to deliver this.
Yeah, so this is what Debbie's saying about we have to draw a line in the sand at some point, which I think we were going to surface on this call actually from that conversation. The idea that when the Gladstone implementation starts, they'll be taking a version of this and running with it as Legend have done. So Legend have delivered the 1 through 8. That's already there, and so that within the work that they're involved in, and so we know that's where a lot of this detail has come from, is that implementation in terms of finding problems and gaps and things like that. Obviously, there'll be more gaps that we'll find as we go through this with Gladstone. So it's just that, you know, what is the most effective way to do that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's 2 issues here. One is surfacing detail, which I saw as the point of the exercise, and to make sure that, you know, Gladstone and Gladstone systems engineers were, you know, familiar with how that all got unpicked, so it wasn't just delivered as a delivery requirement. And to inform the specifications, it's very useful to have that systems implementer perspective. So that to me is the system working, and hopefully by the end of this process, we do have something that can be delivered against. The difficulty from a standards perspective is moving 9 and 10 out of scope makes perfect sense from a standards perspective. It seems to be a more complex area. It involves different kinds of interactions. I suppose the difficulty is if we declare it out of scope, but in fact we've got organizations implementing, we end up with a de facto standard that actually hasn't been fed into, and that is sort of running alongside and unstandardized alongside the standardization process. And it seems like leaving 9 and 10 unspecified raises that risk quite strongly. But from Gladstone's perspective, this is scope creep that they're not prepared to engage in.
I think it might just be a case of doing 1 through 8 first from a technical perspective, and then tackling 9 and 10 at the end, potentially. That might solve both problems.
It can. I suppose it depends. Well, I guess I can leave it to you to work out when phase 2 actually begins. It seems like leaving it to the end makes sense if phase 2 is anticipated to be, January or something. If phase 2 is something that is not roadmapped at all yet, then that seems like a more difficult solution. And equally, if MCR active is thinking that 9 and 10 is in scope, but implementers are feeling like it's out of scope, that seems like a crunch point.
So it sounds like there's an action here to have a conversation that involves MCR and Gladstone and OpenActive.
I think so. Yeah, I think
to figure out 9 and 10. That's yeah.
Okay, so there's a larger requirements and scheduling conversation to be had. Okay.
Can I ask a question, which is sort of an aside? Is there a reason why there isn't an MCR active representative on these calls? Because that seems helpful to me. Or Nick, is that kind of your role in this? As I'm speaking on behalf of MCR active.
That's a good point. I haven't been representing MCR active specifically, but I suppose I'm representing the requirements as I understand them. So yes and no, I guess. I'm not representing the organization. I think Nish did play that role on yesterday's call with Westminster, and could play that role in other places. So I think the idea was that MCR turned up yesterday, talked about requirements, and then taking those requirements, we then talked them through here. Because I imagine this forum, where most of the time in this forum is spent talking about the implementation rather than the requirements, because the requirements should be well defined. But the challenge we've got here is that the requirements are maybe not understood collectively, and it didn't help as well the scheduling of yesterday. And for example, Debbie wasn't on yesterday's call because she couldn't make it, and Anne-Marie was on there, and that's created some ambiguities that we haven't really resolved between now and today. So maybe there's a lesson there as well. Actually, if we maybe need all stakeholders on the same page before we bring it to the technical conversation, potentially.
Because from my perspective, it almost seems like because Legend have already implemented this, we're trying to get kind of guided towards that, as opposed to coming up with what the actual another model that might not match what is in the appendices already. But perhaps...
no, to be clear, there's no expectation that Legend have done it as a bespoke exercise. So there's no expectation that this needs to match what Legend have done at all. We could rip it up and start again if we thought that was better in terms of a design. And certainly, yeah, that's definitely a good route. Obviously, bearing in mind a lot of stakeholders have already been consulted in the creation of this, so that's why it might end up looking similar to this, just because a lot of people have already been. It's not kind of being constructed in a kind of dark room, but yeah, absolutely. If there's a better way of doing stuff, let's do that.
Yeah, it's just so like for concerns about creation of this. I'll use dependent again, even though I know it's out of scope here, but that as an example. System implementers bring a concern that, well, that's not how it works in our system because we don't think that matches the model of the real world. Just need to make sure that is the fact that it's already been done like X doesn't preclude us from saying, okay, yes, you're right, we need to change that. Which which I don't want to speak on anybody else's behalf, but perhaps that is the feeling here, is that we got to do it this way, even though it doesn't fit with what the system does, and we think our system is modeling it correctly. That's where a potential clash may occur.
Yes, certainly. Part of the idea with the dependent accounts conversation that we've kind of brought through from yesterday was to find a model that fitted all. Like it, what's the more generic approach that works for everybody, rather than specifically taking Legend's model or whoever's model. Because if everyone's modeled the world in a slightly different way, I guess whatever we come up with here should model the world as well, but maybe in a way that works with everyone else's models, maybe more generically.
That's going to be very difficult, I guess, because everybody's going to have modeled it differently, but presumably there is an actual model of the real world. I mean, I'll be the first to hold my hand up and say we've modeled things wrong in sports from time to time, and if I could do it again, we would. We can't, but this is almost an opportunity to err like, well, here's a realistic model of how the world works. Yes, there may be implementation challenges for systems to actually deal with that, but trying to cater to the way that everybody has done this stuff, like a little snafu that is a sport-specific snafu and a legend-specific one, would probably be the Venn diagram. They don't fit together kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe it's an exercise in trying and seeing what comes out. So I think we got pretty close with what this diagram represented in terms of something that works for everybody. But the emergency contact detail is obviously a problem. But to your point, Matt, there, if we decided that, for example, the standards just only include a full name and a phone number, and that's all we could capture in there, that might actually be an operational challenge for those organizations involved, which may be a reason to make changes to the standard. If there's a real reason why they need to capture a full address, date of birth, and everything for the adult involved, and that's got operational merit and reasons behind it, then yeah, I suppose there's lots of competing concerns.
I mean, this is the hard work of standards development, right? This is like, it is about reconciling all of those models into a model that's kind of operable for everybody. So I think Matt's right. It is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's not that you always make a decision the same way. I mean, yeah, sometimes you'll decide to ignore operational concerns entirely because there's a high level goal that needs to be satisfied. Other times you need to make concessions because industry practice is so widespread that you can't ignore it. So yeah, unfortunately that means there's like sort of not one answer to give. And this is actually what's concerning me a little bit about 9 and 10 being declared out of scope, is that, like I said before, in principle, we could describe this from a standards perspective and simply not worry about how other organizations meet those requirements if we can come up with a sort of high level enough description of how that should work. I'm happy to defer that until there's more understanding, because there is an operational reality that has to be looked at. But it is a little worrying to say, well, actually, it could be that these are very difficult conditions to satisfy. Therefore, let's defer describing how they should behave. That's kind of a slightly odd calculation to make. But yeah, I think as part of the standards process, sadly, we have to consider everyone's models and yeah, try to find that the smallest possible Venn diagram overlap that will satisfy everybody.
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to rewind a little bit. So if the action is indeed to straighten out requirements with MCR active, so we can see how much this can be deprioritized given the difficulties it's causing at the moment. And maybe if we've got more time to consider it, we can come up with a more satisfactory solution, maybe the beginning of next year. So the agreement was, however, that creating a new customer account, including accounts for children, is in scope. Did we already cover what the requirements for that were satisfactorily yesterday in the W3C call?
I suggest, Tim, that also goes between the MCR and Everactive in the first instance, because it sounds like there's general consensus obviously everyone active wasn't representing yesterday, but there's general consensus, it seems, that we're okay with an emergency contact. But I know that's not a fully representative group that consensus came from. So if it's the case that everyone active, for example, have a different operational or model or whatever, maybe they need to bottom that out with MCR first, just to test that that's the case. If that's what ends up being the case, then maybe we revisit how that can be done.
Yeah, is there a general problem? So yeah, I think yesterday we talked a bit about whether this conversation actually belonged in this call or in the other W3C call. Maybe it looks like it belongs in that other W3C call. I feel like there's I feel like this isn't just an implementation thing. I think there's a general problem, like what happens when there's a mismatch between account creation rules for children on the broker side and the booking system side. Like that's the general problem that needs to be solved. And that probably is something that needs to happen in a forum that's wider than MCR active and engaged organizations there. Although those conversations can inform that wider scoped issue.
So is that a Wednesday conversation as well?
I think it's probably a Wednesday conversation. Yeah. I think this probably needs again to be raised, unfortunately, at the higher level. Okay, so shelving 9 and 10 for discussion in a privately arranged meeting with MCR active and stakeholders, and shelving 2A for the moment for discussion at a future W3C higher level discussion. Okay, let us spin back then to, oh, sorry, haha, I have a really trivial nomenclature question, which we don't have to solve here, but if we could decide whether they're dependent accounts with an E or dependent accounts with an A, that would be great. The thing is, I think they're both correct. It could be an account for a dependent, in which case that's fine, or it can be an account which is dependent, which is also fine, but we have to work out which we're using and stick with it.
Oh, you're totally right. It's probably an A, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. Because yeah, in fact, we just had this conversation. I mean, everyone active, they're linked accounts, but they're not dependent exactly. So yeah, I think maybe it's
Should we just update that throughout the document?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and I'll do that while you're looking at the next thing.
Okay, so great. So a little bit of bike shedding there, maybe, but
no, I'm good to go back.
I've just checked in the dictionary, and it looks like it should be E rather than A.
Perfect. So dependent.
Yeah.
Done.
Is it? I think it's dependent, as in a child, who is your child.
Yeah, well, one's a noun, the child. One's an adjective, the relationship of dependence. So yeah, the account is dependent potentially, but the person that it's about is the dependent. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a British versus US spelling thing. So it depends on whether we've gone for British spellings or US spellings elsewhere in the specs.
We're US because of schema. Schema's US.
Yeah, and the US spelling is with an E rather than an A.
All right.
You're looking at a wrong dictionary. Okay, well, that's something I'm going to be looking up. Okay, but yeah, so if we treat it as a US UK distinction, I guess, yeah, then E is oh, sorry, hold on, that's broader than that though. So are we bound by schema.org kind of determinations there for this kind of nomenclature?
We've been consistent with the US naming because schemas we follow schemas naming rules.
Right.
They've got a document on naming, so things like case and using full words instead of shortened words and stuff.
Right, but these won't necessarily be schema.org classes. I guess they could potentially be.
That's a good question.
Yeah,
it's a good point. So does the whole document get written in US English as a result? Yeah, I see what you're saying. Or is it only the key kind of phrases that we reuse that may be both used in models and in
Upsettingly, the current booking spec has both.
Oh.
Oh
wow.
Okay. let's take this onto Slack. Yeah. Boy, I had no idea it was going to be that as complicated as that. But I think there's a wider question, yeah, about anything that is going to be a schema.org model or construct makes sense, of course, to follow schema.org spelling. But yeah, whether that means the document as a whole needs to be written in. I feel like probably the answer has to be no, because actually,
yeah,
the first feedback we'll get from anybody is that everything's misspelled, first of all, for a UK audience. And then also, I mean, the drafter of this document is a UK English speaker. So trying to ventriloquize American English seems like it would be annoying impedance for Nick.
Agreed.
Okay, so I'll raise that on Slack about the dependent distinction. Okay, so
as usual, myself and I think Debbie's going to have to drop off very shortly. We've got a call.
Okay, right.
Just before you guys go, I know we had this. That was a long discussion, which I know there was frustrations there. Are we feeling good about the resolution to have a further call on this, Andy, Debbie? I mean, are you guys still feeling level of frustration, or?
No, I think once we have the call and we're ironed out with regards to what the level of expectation is, and the agreements between everyone active, MCR, and we know where we're going, I think we'll be in a better place.
Great. Okay. And Debbie, how are you feeling?
Overjoyed.
I'll take the diplomatic approach.
Yeah. Well done, Andy.
Anyway. Right, really sorry, guys. I need to drop off. I'll speak to you all again. Well, not before. I'll see you all on Wednesday next week. Oh, no, that's another week away, isn't it? Is it next Thursday?
Thursday. Week Thursday, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Andy shared his notes from the call yesterday with me this morning. They've been passed on to Dave. Dave has concerns, so we'll have to set something up with Anne-Marie and the managers for that area and have a conversation.
Okay. Yeah, understood. Okay. That sounds like I see. Maybe the would next time it may be worth us making sure that we're all on that calls, because otherwise, yeah, it's not going to be constructive if we don't. I totally didn't realize there was a scheduling clash, Debbie. We could have thought about other ways of solving that problem potentially, but okay, yeah, no problem. Sounds
okay.
Conversation to pick up.
All right, cheers. See you later.
Okay, see you.
Okay, so we've got 30 minutes remaining. I think I'm going to just skip around a bit. In the previous call, the last Thursday's call, there were a couple of issues that arose. One was about associating a barcode with a customer account in section 5. The issue specifically was that sometimes access is pin based. And I think we got to a point where we determined it would be possible to use a separate schema.org construct to represent that. So there's access passes for there's barcodes for things that are like barcodes. So schema.org barcode could be a QR code, or it could be a mag stripe or something like that. But for a pin code, the schema.org construct access code would be the relevant construct. And so the question that was left hanging was whether we needed to add that to the customer account model, really, or whether it was possible to add that to the customer account model. Do we, who are currently still on the call, feel like this is a question that we're competent to answer, or would we need Debbie and Andy's input there to really come to a conclusion?
Well, so as a modeling question, I had looked at this actually this week in the document, and access code. It's a real challenge actually throughout the spec if we because I think the code was being used as a unique identifier, almost as if it's an access pass in the use case we talked about with Nathan, rather than kind of a one-off code. Mm-hmm. And so I do wonder whether we should extend access pass out to include access codes. so that we've just got the same construct that's being used everywhere. Otherwise, we create this kind of weird dual mechanisms just for the sake of the model, where actually they're really the same.
So I guess the two questions, the immediate question is, sorry, so are pins, do they work as unique identifiers? I guess that's a question.
I mean, I guess they could do.
But is that a policy that sort of we can rely upon to be enforced, that pins will be unique?
I mean, it very much depends on the venue, doesn't it?
I doubt it, because you know the tennis venue down the road, the pin number is the same on the fence. Doesn't matter. You don't get a different pin for every person.
But this is the thing. If it says at the top they're associating a barcode with a customer account, and we're talking about pin identifiers, if it's not unique to the customer account, then isn't it just an access code that you get per booking rather than an account-based access code?
True.
Yeah, I guess so.
So that's already catered for by the booking spec, by the access code that gets produced by every booking. So I guess in that case, maybe we don't need to worry about it in the membership scope.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, right. So that is not associated with the customer account. So it's associated with the opportunity that's booked.
When the orders, the order items each have a
right. Okay.
Within the order.
Okay. Right. Okay.
So I guess in the case of the tennis, single pin tennis court, I guess they'll just be the same pin returned every order item for that.
Right. Okay. So it doesn't have to live on the customer account; just lives on the order item. Okay. And that gets around the prefixing problem as well, because it doesn't have to be unique.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no further point of discussion there. And then the other point that was left lingering was on Appendix C1, customer account right now has got a schema person that can be associated with it as the customer, but some organizations associate organization as well with customer account.
Yeah, so I also I went through and made that amendment in the various places within the document.
Okay.
It's a really good one to bring up because I think I was assuming from the last call we'd agreed that it was a thing. I think a few people nodded and said yes, they have organizations that make bookings. It's slightly problematic for something in an appendix way further down that I can point at. So yeah. If you jump down to where my face is on the thing, you jump there. Here we go. If you scroll down slightly, you'll see my notes on the right. Right. So this quite last minute. This was the problem that this creates is that the type is used in other places. So if we have a different types, then actually when we specify that the booking is for a particular customer account, the moment the way that's happening is that there's a has account like this and there's a type that's referencing it. The problem is because the type can be both either person or organization, that actually is a pain because we're then just purely for the sake of modeling having to store the type on the broker side so that it can make the appropriate request. And my suggestion to get around this, so for context, if you make a C2 call in booking using the OpenID Connect token for the customer, then the current proposal here is that the customer included in the C2 call needs to look like this in order for the call to go ahead and book for that customer. And the response would then look like what you can see below. So obviously it's the same as a person comes back, but the person has an account and there's the account details in there. It's kind of an inversion of account is inside. Person's usually inside customer account. It's just inverts it, so the other way around. A proposal to get around that problem that this is introduced is that we actually just remove this completely. So C2 doesn't include a customer because you can already infer it from the authentication. We don't need to include it again. So therefore, we don't need to worry about the broker doesn't need to populate either of the type or the has account fields, which actually may simplify the whole thing anyway. I mean, there could be a question of why are we just being pedantic by getting them to use that, both in the authentication and in has account. They're actually specifying the same information twice, and then we're cross-checking it. Is that really necessary to cross-check? I mean, they've already got an auth key, so they probably know what they're doing. Just know what you guys.
You'll end up adding it back in though, won't you? So when dependents are actually on the table, because this customer property is who the booking is for. Is that right?
It's booked by. So the customer is the person making the booking, and then the attendee are the people.
Fine. Yeah,
that's a really good point. Yes, excellent point. Actually, yes, because attendees can't be organizations. Attendees must be people. So we don't have this issue with attendees. So we can use has account, as you say, exactly for dependent accounts. Would work for attendees.
Okay, that's very neat. I guess my question is there anything that the broker needs in this has account object that it can't get through the authentication process?
Oh, sorry, I was saying, suggesting that the response remains the same. It's the request that changes. So we. Oh,
so. I thought you were saying that this would be eliminated as well.
No. So
okay.
This is just this gets removed.
Okay, I see. Right. So yes, you've authenticated, so this information gets returned. Okay, right. Yeah.
So we know who you are because you've provided an auth token.
Right. Yeah.
Therefore, you don't need to specify that again in the request in a different place.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Sorry, for some reason when you said we're getting rid of has account, I thought you meant this body here. But okay. That only leaves me with the question of why Jeff Capes is always the example in OpenActive.
I bet that's Lee. I don't know.
That's Lee. Okay, right. I won't.
Can use Lee's name whenever something's. I feel like that's probably one of those things that's become. You just check the modeling spec. I feel like that's probably come from somewhere.
Okay. It is a real person. So.
Oh right.
Yeah.
Is he famous?
Reasonably, he was a professional wrestler, I think. I'm wondering if we should change that actually, in case Jeff Capes is like, why?
I have literally no idea. And who's Ralph Capes? Is that related?
I don't know. I mean, I can do some research and find out, but we might be safer with more generic names.
It's like Da Vinci Code level.
Yeah. The clue. Okay.
Does that? I know that Nathan was looking as well. Does that work from your perspective, Nathan? This approach changed. Do you think?
Yeah, it does. Adding in extra information is fine.
Okay, I think the only question that leaves me with for the organization then is, sorry, just scrolling here. So we've got a model for person associated with customer account, or do we need a model for what organization looks like as customer?
Yes, good idea.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Good idea. Add the heading.
Okay, cool.
Yes. So there's probably some properties that they both have in common. The way that this works in the booking spec, I think, is that the customer, let's just check, is it the modeling spec? There's a table which basically is both.
Yeah, okay, so just a similar approach here.
Yeah, although I don't think it's probably not quite the same because this one's got really personal.
True, yeah.
So it might be a bit more specific actually. But there is a common, I mean, in fact, the .NET project leverages the commonality between organization and person so that there actually does an abstract interface over both.
Okay.
So you can treat them as the same when you go through the whole booking flow because, yeah, you can book on behalf of either. And it'll still be the case in membership, but the customer could be either.
Okay, cool.
Although, does this also bring additional challenges to modifications? So if you go to D3,
is that where you are?
yeah. Scroll down a little bit to the bottom there. So you can see there you've got the person update action.
Right. Yes, that will be.
So this is all
Different.
customer account person update action type person.
Yeah.
So we need actually to use a more generic name here, probably.
Well, and I mean, a lot of the fields are going to be different as well, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. So it's interesting whether we actually define two separate endpoints here or the same endpoint that just can apply to both. Is it okay to have just one endpoint that handles either type rather than defining two endpoints for this?
I think if I were coding it, I would prefer to have two separate endpoints.
I think if they're two different things, it probably, I think it makes sense to have two separate endpoints.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, is it only because it's just double the stuff to specify? Because if you go further down, you'll see why. If you go to D4, so D4 is the initialize action. And so this is after you've created an account, which I know we haven't spoken about yet. You initialize the account before it can get used, and initialize, and this actually uses, if you scroll down to the request response, it's the same pattern there.
Right.
So we're looking at duplicating initialize action potentially also. Then you switch on depending on what type, and then you switch on your initialization.
Yep. I feel like any other solution, I mean, yeah, that switch is going to have to be somewhere. And I feel like it's easier on the calling side than on the responding side.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that.
So what's that? Remind me of the use case here. Is this so somebody is creating an organization as opposed to creating their own account? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so a use case for this would be things like football clubs and stuff.
Right. So the broker is going to allow them to create a club account at the broker level and then expect for the booking system to also have the ability to do that too.
Yeah, because the booking system already supports organizations instead of customers. So it makes sense to reflect it here.
That's in the booking API, is it?
Yeah.
Does that give you heavy doubts, Matt?
Well, sports can't do that. So sports would not be able to take a booking on behalf of, well, you could take a booking on behalf of a team, so we could probably kind of hack it in. But in terms of the booking API implementation that we have done, that must have been in one of the tests that we did not, that's not on our certificate, if you like. Yeah.
So how does it work for a team?
There is no way to book online for a team, but within the administrative control panel, the administrators can create a block booking for a team. That's usually the use cases where a team wants to create a block booking and the person who's responsible for paying may change over time.
Okay, so is this worth wider reflection on, in that I think there seem to be a lot of block booking is just a very, very different kind of beast. And it's cropped up a couple of times in relation to the booking spec. Would it make sense to say that actually organizational bookings only apply to block bookings? Can we maybe save this problem for a larger approach to block bookings?
I don't know if that seems artificial. I don't know what do you think, Nathan?
Yeah, I'd say that's not necessarily the case.
Okay.
I mean, I could run the numbers and see if I could find orders on our system that aren't block bookings but do belong to organizations, if that would be helpful, just so we know that does actually exist.
I guess there's a more general sense though in that it didn't strike you as crazy that this might happen, that a football club might want to book an individual session.
Yeah. Especially, I guess the use case would be if their usual pitch is unavailable at the time that they want. They might want to book a nearby pitch that they don't normally do block bookings for.
That seems like a quite reasonable use case, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so we do want to keep this in scope for this document then, the organizational booking. Well, then we're stuck with branching, I guess. And I guess further complexity about what has to happen, what kind of conversations have to happen out of band about what an organization needs to supply in terms of information and so on.
Yeah, I suppose.
It's a shame to have to consider this, really, because in phase 1, part 1, whatever, because I would imagine that this is a very unlikely use case that brokers would be looking to support off the bat. I mean, does Playfinder allow you to create an organization and book on behalf of an organization, Nathan?
BookTech does.
I know BookTech does, but does Playfinder?
Yes, I believe it does as well.
Does it?
Yeah, it's not quite as clean. It's essentially, there's no real difference between a customer and an organization at Playfinder's side, but you can change it at BookTech, and then that will kind of like filter back through. So
on the Playfinder side, it's the same thing, that it's just called into your NAN FC.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of the person's name, so which I would almost argue is not having the concept of a club at the broker side.
Yes, I see what you mean.
It just seems like a whole lot of extra complexity, especially in the flow from the broker side, to cater for a scenario that's not going to bring a lot of bookings, put it that way, whereas the other way.
Could I make sorry, and just a separate argument, something. Yes, I guess my key concern is that because the booking spec supports this, we don't support it in memberships. There's kind of like an inconsistency between the two, where we've obviously thought about it in one case and not in another. But I totally agree in terms of creating lots of extra complexity. I know we were just talking about having 2 different endpoints. Can I make a counter argument for about that? Is that the current booking spec does have switching on the way the booking spec currently handles it is it uses organization and person as a switch on type, and in the .NET code mentioned earlier, what that allows is an abstraction to be used, which is an interface that covers both.
In which case, the endpoint then needs to have a much more generic name than, well, currently it had person in there, it didn't. This one, or have you removed that already? And now it's customer account. Was person in there somewhere before?
Wasn't person? Yeah, it was.
And you've removed that?
No, they're still there. If you go up to the previous D3, I haven't changed it. Yeah, that's the.
Yeah, that one. That would
need
to be more generic than that.
Yeah. I feel like it's so much cleaner to have separate endpoints.
Well, I suppose it's clean in different ways, because we have this challenge with C1 and C2. C1 and C2 are different endpoints for reasons of, there's a lot that could happen that's different there, but also for organizations that don't have a difference, they don't implement leasing. C1 and C2 are the same, so actually it creates more complexity for those that treat them. So if we create separate endpoints here, we create more complexity for everyone in the system. And the assumption is that those records are treated very differently. Whereas if in most cases, it's kind of what PlayFinder already does, where they're basically just the same record. They've just got a flag on them saying organizational person, and they're really the same thing in the database at the end of the day. Then splitting it might create more work for everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point. In book tech, they're the same entity in the database. They just have different properties. So customers and organizations are treated exactly the same most of the time, except when we're displaying the information.
Okay, so at the data model level, they're identical, really. Okay.
Which I guess kind of is how it actually works in the booking spec as well.
Yeah, that's right. In the booking spec, they're the same.
Yeah.
And the properties are overlap intentionally so they can be modeled similarly.
Yeah, and then that makes it much easier from an implementer's standpoint, because if you've got one endpoint and you don't accept organizations, you can just ignore it.
Okay. And I guess, yeah, well, I think the argument that pulls the heaviest weight with me is just the consistency that actually, yes, if it's like this in the booking spec already, then defining it differently here is just kind of a gotcha for implementers. Okay. So then I guess, as Matthew pointed out, it's kind of just a naming convention. I guess we still need to define what an organization looks like as opposed to a person, but through one endpoint. Okay.
So actually, if we use the word customer, which is the property name rather than the type. So if you go up to the previous section in the model, there you go. So yeah, so in the customer account, it's the customer, which is a type person. So if we lean on the customer as the naming,
yeah,
and then just use that, then that could.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's completely correct, isn't it? If a customer can be an organization or a person, and update customer, therefore, it implies it could be either of those entity types. Sure. Yeah. Cool. But yeah, we still have to define that model, and I suppose show it in the examples as well. So there's a documentation exercise there.
Yeah.
And is it basically a question of using the organization model as defined in the booking spec?
Let's have a look at what that says. It is very light, but it does exist.
Right.
We could just use it as is, yeah.
Okay, cool.
It's the email, name, telephone number, address.
Okay. Is there a contact details there at all?
No.
In the same way that, because I feel like in the same way that there's an emergency contact in person, I feel like with the organization, you probably should have it named.
Well, an organization, normally what you have is the primary holder of the account is just the same details. So it's got the name and telephone details at the top level. It's rare that you have an organization with like an official like office number rather than just someone's phone number.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I guess we're talking about fairly informal organizations most of the time, aren't we? It's
Yeah.
Okay.
That's so interesting though, because I think that actually gives us a potential. It's potentially the case that the booking spec in this area hasn't been fully implemented because, as you say, Nathan, it's very obvious, isn't it? You need a person associated with that organization to. Well, I don't know. Is that right? At the moment, it's just got email address and name, but you wouldn't be able to put that contact detail in. It's in your database where you've got. Is it in the database? Is it just that you've got a person? The record is the same record. It's just that the organization has additional fields for the organization name. Do you know what I mean? And all the other person details are the same.
Yeah. So the main difference is the organization has a name but doesn't need a first or last name, and I believe the organization doesn't need a gender, whereas our customers do.
And do you then capture the first and last name of the primary contact separately?
Let me check.
That might be an interesting thing to think about.
from our side, obviously we're dealing with teams as opposed to organizations, but there is no, the team is a completely separate entity with associated people, some of whom may be the primary contact, or the roles within that team are completely configurable. But that's an organizational hack in and of itself. You know, a team is not necessarily an organization. But I would, you know, in the real world, I think that an organization doesn't necessarily have to have anybody associated with it. It can exist on its own. It wouldn't, but you know, in the real world, that is the case.
Could do, yeah. Yeah. No reason why you couldn't just make a booking for the organization. Someone's got a email. Yeah.
Sorry, Nathan, are you hunting up schema details?
Yes. Just trying to find some example customers in our database. Yeah, we do capture the first and last name.
It's in a separate field, is it?
Yeah, so we've got 3 fields. We've got first name, last name, and organization name.
So if you've got, so in an organization, is the first name and last name the same as the fields that are used for a person? First name, last name. Yeah, it's just the organization name. Yeah, that was my intuition as well. Because you probably just use the same model, wouldn't you? Just stick an organization bit in there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that comes close to a consensus then, that we need another model for organizations, but we don't need to then associate individual persons with that account. Okay, so I think the actions taken away from the first part of the call, various meetings need to happen to clarify requirements and timetable. We need to argue about dependent versus dependant on Slack, I think. And we need to extend customer so that it can also accommodate organizations as well in the documentation.
Yep.
I think that's everything. Okay, well, thank you for continuing on with the call for the final half hour, which felt more decisive than the first hour. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.
Cool. See you next week, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.